All right. So my name is Natalie Warren, like Tony said, and in 2011, I was one of the first two women to paddle from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay, recreating Eric Sevareid's route from the book Canoeing with the Cree. Eric Sevareid did this route with Walter Port in 1930, where they left from Pike Island and Fort Snelling State Park in St. Paul, paddled upstream on the Minnesota River, downstream on the Red River, all the way up through Manitoba to York Factory on Hudson Bay. I'm originally from Miami, Florida, and I did not grow up camping at all. And I actually attended an arts high school for saxophone performance, and I got really burnt out when I was 15. And I remember thinking, I really need to find something else that I like to do because all I did all day long was play the saxophone. A friend of mine told me about a YMCA camp up in Minnesota called YMCA Camp Minojan, where he went canoeing every summer. And so I remember coming home really excited, telling my mom I was going to go canoeing in Minnesota. I am the youngest of three children. And so I always liked to sort of come home and announce dramatic things. And so when I was 15, I came to Minnesota by myself and I went on a 2-week canoe trip in the Boundary Waters Wilderness Canoe area in northern Minnesota. That was my first overnight camping experience, a 2-week Boundary Waters trip, and it absolutely blew me away. No one really knew where I was. Back home, my mom wrote me a letter saying, I hope you enjoy the beautiful mountains of Minnesota. And one night I woke up in the middle of the night and I kept hearing a wolf howling and I got really nervous and I woke up all my other campmates and they laughed at me because it was actually just a loon. And I had never heard a call of a loon before. And so I was very, very new to the Northwoods, very new to canoe expeditions when I was a teenager. But I went through a progression of trips through YMCA Camp Minojan, where I then went on a 30-day canoe trip in Ontario, and then a 50-day canoe trip paddling the Kazan-Kunwak Inuit Heritage Rivers in Nunavut, Canada. That is where I met my friend Anne, who is pictured here. Anne and I were assigned paddling partners for this long trip through Minojan. And we were in our first couple days just making small talk. And I asked her, where are you going to school in the fall? It was the summer before college. And she said, St. Olaf College. And I said, no way, me too. And as fate would have it, we ended up in the same freshman dorm. And for 4 years, we were plotting our next adventure. Whenever things got hard, we'd always end up on the futon in Anne's dorm room, wondering, where can we go next? What can we do next? So senior year rolls around, and it's 2011. The recession from 2008 was still hitting us pretty hard in terms of employment opportunities after graduating. So Anne and I were both applying to a bunch of jobs, not hearing back at all, getting really frustrated with the whole process. And after winter break, we come back and Anne knocks on my door. I let her in and she hands me Canoeing with the Cree, the book written by Eric Sevareid, uh, documenting his route from Minneapolis up to Hudson Bay. She said, read it, I think we should do this. And she left. And so that night, I remember I was supposed to be writing a paper. Instead, I read the book from cover to cover. And the next day I went to Anne and I said, okay, let's do it. We didn't have a canoe. We didn't have any money. Basically everything you would need to do this trip, we did not have. But we had a lot of enthusiasm and we decided to do it. So we started telling our community about it. We started reaching out to media. And before we knew it, within the course of several months, we had raised enough money to cover the expenses for our trip. We were fully sponsored with gear and food. We ended up in Outside magazine, and really people just supported us as much as possible because they really wanted us to do this trip. 2 days after we graduated college, we left upstream on the Minnesota River. So here is our route. So to go north, you actually have to go southwest first, and then the Minnesota River does a bit of a check mark, and then you're going north up through the Red River, up the east shore of Lake Winnipeg. Then we took the Nelson River to Etchemamish Creek, which connects to the Hayes River, which is a little bit different than Eric Sevareid's route at that point. He took the Gods River. And then we connected with the Gods, paddled out to York Factory on Hudson Bay. Here we go. So here is a video of us launching. You may recall this, since I assume many of you are in Iowa. There was a huge flood in 2011, and we were leaving during peak flood stage, paddling upstream for 330 miles on the Minnesota River. This is where we launched, and you can see here, this is how fast we were going for 330 miles. We were paddling 1.5 miles an hour. It is perhaps the slowest form of transportation. We could have walked the Minnesota River faster than we paddled it. But we got to appreciate every leaf on every tree. And the beginning or the end of the Minnesota River is a national wildlife refuge. And people before the trip would tell us the Minnesota River is the river of chocolate milk. It is a polluted agricultural river, and it's too bad that you have to paddle it as a part of this route. We had very low expectations going into it. But what we found in the first couple days is otters coming up and swimming by our boat, and lush, beautiful wildlife and vegetation. This is in no way to say that the Minnesota River is not a polluted river. It is a highly damaged ecosystem, and agriculture has made a very big impact on this waterway. However, paddling on top of the water and being able to traverse through the communities and through different parts of the Minnesota River Valley was absolutely gorgeous. As we paddled this area, and then I later, several years later, went on to paddle the entire Mississippi River, you start to see scars that we've left on the landscape, in the words of Rachel Carson from Silent Spring. You start to see the industries, you start to see the places where we get our energy to do our everyday things that are oftentimes hidden from the public. When you're on rivers, you see sort of the dark underbelly that keeps society running. So we had a lot of time to reflect on these things and think about the interconnected systems that make life run. Agriculture was something that we saw and encountered a lot on the Minnesota River. I studied environmental policy in college, and so of course I thought if I'd been talking about these things and reading about these things that I knew everything there was to know about environmental policy, especially pertaining to buffer zones on agricultural fields. But of course, as we know, when you get out into the world, a lot of those policies don't actually reflect what's happening on the land. We saw very few buffer zones, if any, and granted it was a flood, but the river was flowing directly over cornfields, and the fertilizer, the nitrogen, the phosphorus from those fields was not even just running off into the river, it was going directly into that body of water that then flows into the Mississippi River. It impacts communities downstream, and then it reaches, of course, the Gulf of Mexico, where we have the dead zone, where all of this excess nitrogen is causing algal blooms and doesn't allow underwater aquatic life to live. So we were seeing the very beginning of what is a global problem. The Minnesota River has more water in the valley than it ever has before. When it rains, water used to sink into the ground and refill the groundwater system. What happens now is that the water hits the ground and it's directed through a tiling system on agricultural fields and shoots right out into the river at a very quick pace. This increases flooding and makes flood events even more drastic and quickly erodes the banks of the river, causing more sediment to flow downstream. I was pretty upset about all this, seeing all of these things. It's no fun to paddle near your home and realize that it is a damaged landscape. But on this trip, we got to stay with farmers. The river was flooded. We had to knock on farmers' doors and say, hey, can we camp on your property? We can't find anywhere to camp along the river. And we would end up having really great conversations with people who had extremely different views than we had. And it was a wildly educational trip for us to understand that farmers care so much for their land. They are not purposely polluting our waterways, right? They are in a system in which they cannot choose to do anything differently. They are paid by yield. I'm going to pause real quick and take the squeaky toy away from my dog. All right, sorry about that. So this photo is a picture of us paddling upstream towards the Granite Falls Dam. Paddling upstream was really challenging, but as you can see from this picture, the water against our canoe in front of the boat, how hard we are paddling. Paddling upstream to a dam is really challenging because the current is often stronger in those sections of the river. So Anne and I are huffing and we're puffing and we're paddling as hard as we can. And I look over and I see that there's a path along the river that goes up to the dam. And we decided together that we were going to pull over and portage or carry all of our things to the other side and put back in the river. Just as we decided to do this, a journalist from Granite Falls popped out of the bushes and started taking pictures of us and saying, "You can do it. You can paddle all the way to the dam." So our plans changed. Instead, we spent about 45 minutes paddling less than half a mile up to a dam. Meanwhile, the residents of Granite Falls start gathering along the river. The mayor shows up. We finally make it to the dam and we take our boat out. And the mayor says, "I've never even seen two guys do that before." And I remember thinking, why would anybody do that? After paddling upstream on the Minnesota River, we paddled downstream on the Red River of the North. So we were paddling about 12 to 15 miles a day on the Minnesota River upstream, and we were finally going downstream, paddling 50 to 60 miles per day. So it was still in flood stage, and we were paddling about 5 miles an hour. This is a monument that we encountered along our trip. It is 5 empty tractor seats to represent the disappearance of the family farm. So we would paddle past dilapidated buildings, we would go through farmland, and we'd go up to knock on people's doors to see if we could camp on their land, and it was very obvious that nobody lived there anymore. So with the advancement in agriculture technology, what has happened is that fewer people can farm a larger amount of acreage, and that has had a great impact on the communities along these rivers. We would often stay with people along the riverways, and they would give us a tour of their town, and the theme was always, "This place used to be really cool," right? But a lot of the younger generation, they're going to the cities, they're going off to school, and they're not coming back to take over their farm. This was not always the case. Some communities were very vibrant, and we went through Climax, Minnesota, where a group called the International Water Institute hosted a barbecue for us, and they do educational programs where they take kids out on the Red River and they take water samples and talk about water quality and try to bring the community back to its riverway. We were at this barbecue and people kept telling us the same thing over and over again. In the neighboring town of Fertile, there was a woman who was in their community and she was murdered. And the next morning, the newspaper title said, "Fertile woman dies in Climax," which actually is a joke that the Star Tribune, the paper in Minneapolis, has requested that people stop telling. So I'm sorry for telling that joke. But they were great. They hosted us. On the Red River, we had to cross the border into Canada. There is not a border station on the Red River. There is one 2 miles off of the river. So Anne beforehand had sent over our passports, let the border station know what we were up to, and they agreed to meet us on the banks of the river so that we wouldn't spend a whole day walking to the border station, checking in, and then getting back to the water. But we didn't really know what to expect. So we are just paddling along the river like any normal day, and we turn a corner and there are 2 huge black SUVs on the top of a bridge. And when they see us, they turn their sirens on. They drive down to the riverbank and we start to paddle toward them. 6 border agents come off in full garb, shiny black boots, sunglasses, hats, the whole deal, and we're paddling toward them. The Red River is extremely muddy, especially in flood stage. And so generally what we would do is paddle as close as we could to shore, get stuck in mud, hop out, walk really fast so we wouldn't sink in the mud, and then eventually make our way there. So of course, we're used to doing this, but now we had an audience to watch us struggle through the mud. When we got to the border agents, they looked down at their shiny shoes, they looked down at our muddy feet and looked out at our canoe stuck in the mud, and they said, "We are not going to go over to your canoe." why don't you go grab your gun and we'll take you to the border station to sign a waiver. We brought a shotgun with us for protection in polar bear country, really to ease the nerves of our parents so that they felt like we had protection if anything did happen. Anne went to the border station to sign a waiver for the gun, and I stayed on the shore with these 3 agents. And I was pretty good at making small talk. And so I was like, how do you like your job? And I was getting these really short 1-word answers. And so I just gave up altogether. And after a while, we were just standing in silence. And I was wondering what was taking Anne so long. Anne heats up really easily and she turns bright red when she's nervous. It was a really hot day in July and she was at the border station and she started sweating and heating up. And so they had to keep her for acting suspicious and ask her further questions. Finally, they let her go. She came back and we set off on the Red River, this time in Canada. Canada to us means poutine. We were burning thousands of calories a day, and all we wanted was French fries covered in gravy and cheese curds. So we pulled into the first small town that we saw. We walked to a bar. I opened the door and I said, "Do you guys have poutine?" And the bartender stopped what he was doing and looked up and very seriously said, "We have the best poutine in Manitoba," which was great. So we stayed, we played some pool, we ate some poutine, and then classic Natalie and Anne adventure, we decided after carbo loading that we had enough energy to paddle 100 miles straight overnight to get to Winnipeg. We knew that there were no more dams in the way, and we knew that Anne's parents were going to meet us in Winnipeg. So we were going to be able to sleep in a bed in a hotel. So we could really push ourselves and then take a whole day off to rest. So we took off at night. This is around 10:30 p.m. The sun was still out. And this is around 11:30 p.m. This is the moon around 1 a.m. Anne and I were starting to feel sleepy, so we started to sing Cat Stevens' Moon Shadow because we were making moon shadows in the canoe as we paddled, but we only knew the first verse, so we just kept repeating it over and over again until we started to go crazy, and then we'd sing a different song. We really liked the idea that in the summer, in July, on the outskirts of Winnipeg, people probably had their windows open, and through the night they could hear river sirens singing. The sun began to show, or light in the sky began to show around 4:30 or 5. At this point, we could clock our miles. We were going about 5 miles per hour. We knew that we would arrive in Winnipeg at 7 a.m. So this is around 5:30. It was a beautiful sunrise. And we knew we were about to sleep and catch up on our rest. However, at 7 a.m., we saw this. It's just a sign that says danger, and it's pointing at the river, and it's very clearly meant for us. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I tend to be a little bit more laissez-faire than Anne, and Anne was very concerned about this sign. So we pulled over, and as I'm laying back in the canoe, falling in and out of sleep, I hear Anne on her phone calling authority figures asking, "There's a danger sign on the Red River? No, you don't know anything about that? Okay." And nobody knew what this was. And so eventually she got back in the boat and we just had to continue on the river. Well, it turns out the floodgates were open that season. And when we turned the corner, there was a massive dam with rushing white water at the bottom and a control tower at the top. Danger. So what we did is we paddled to one side and all we saw were massive boulders all the way up to a road and the same on the other side. So we had to paddle across the river. We practiced what we would use later when we got to a whitewater river, a technique called forward ferrying, in which we turned our canoe against the current and we angled it at a 45-degree angle, pointing at the opposite shore, because if we paddled straight across the river, we would just get sucked into the dam. And then we forward ferried across the water to the other side where there was not a path either. So we spent 3 hours portaging all of our gear over these rocks to the other side, back and forth. And finally, our last round, we were crossing the road, and a guy comes out of the control tower, and he's looking relaxed, well rested, cup of coffee, the last person you want to see when you're tired and angry. And he said, "Where are you all going?" We said, "Well, we're paddling to Hudson Bay." And we kept going. And then I see Anne think, and she turns around and she just starts yelling at him about how he needs to make sure the sign has a number on it and all these things. Meanwhile, I'm dragging her back down saying, "Thank you for letting us portage your dam." So we finally get to Winnipeg. This is where the Assiniboine River flows into the Red River. And again, huge flood year. So this wharf area of Winnipeg was all shut down due to the high waters. We got to stay in a hotel. I convinced Anne that we needed to see the premiere of Harry Potter 6, I think it was, because we wouldn't be able to see it for another month and a half. We spent some time with her parents, and then we prepared for what was one of the most challenging parts of our expedition, Lake Winnipeg. So Lake Winnipeg is the 11th largest lake in the world in terms of surface area. It's actually very shallow. And so when storms come through and the winds blow, the waves pick up very quickly. We had heard horror stories about paddling Lake Winnipeg, but our first couple days, this is what the lake looked like for us. It was completely flat. So we would float out in the lake kilometers away from shore, just having a good time, thinking, what were people talking about? This isn't so bad. We were finally getting into the wilderness part of our trip. We were starting to see more wildlife, and we started to see more natural beauty. For example, this sunset. The sun every night would sink into the horizon. We started to do night paddles because the wind wasn't as strong at night. And one night we were doing a night paddle, the moon didn't come out, something felt weird in the air. It was very hot all of a sudden. So we decided to pull over and set up camp. It's a good thing we did because a huge lightning storm came through and the sky turned orange and we could just look out the flap of our tent at the lightning striking the lake. And so we were thankful not to be out there. We fell asleep, and then hours later, I wake up, I look up to the top of the tent, and there were 2 huge bear claws pushing down at the top of our tent. And so I jumped to the other side, and I screamed, "Anne, get the foghorn!" Anne's mom had prepared us in every way possible, and that included a small foghorn for the sole purpose of scaring bears away. So we didn't think we would ever use it. But next thing you know, we are rummaging through all of our gear in the middle of the night during a storm looking for a small foghorn. We finally found it and we go outside and we try to push it and it just goes. It must have gotten wet at some point, but it did not work. It was not a huge deal though, because it was a black bear. You look really big, you make loud sounds, and the bear ran back into the woods. The next morning, we were having a leisurely breakfast. The storm had passed, but the winds were still very strong from the west, so we couldn't paddle. And I remember I grabbed the foghorn and I put it right next to Anne's face. I was like, "I can't believe this thing didn't work last night." And I pushed it and it went, "Bah!" This was an average day for us on Lake Winnipeg. Somewhat choppy waves, totally manageable, but we got to use a spray skirt to make sure that none of the water came into our boat. We would see storms coming our way far in the distance. We could still paddle an hour or two and see this in front of us. And when the storm came, we would pull over and wait. I did not take this picture. If you've ever tried to take a picture of the Northern Lights with a mediocre camera, it doesn't really work. Anne and I got along really well for 2 people who were together for 100 days straight, always within sight of each other, always having to work as one body. However, we did have our problems. I think the biggest rift in our relationship during this trip was that Anne thought I didn't take our safety seriously enough, and I thought Anne was too anxious about the decisions that we had to make. And while this can actually make for a really wonderful, balanced expedition relationship, this rift began to grow and grow and grow until it reached a tipping point on Lake Winnipeg. We were starting a night paddle. The lake was completely flat. The stars were out, you could see the Milky Way, and they were reflecting on the lake, so it looked like we were paddling through space. It was gorgeous. I was in the stern, which means I was controlling the direction that the canoe went, and Anne thought that I was pointed a little bit too far away from shore. So I thought that I fixed this, but apparently I didn't fix it enough for Anne's liking. And this one thing is what sparked us to get into a very, very large fight about things that happened before the trip and during the trip. And before you know it, we are in the middle of the wilderness, completely quiet, beautiful, still night, and we are yelling at each other in the middle of a massive lake. Unbeknownst to us during this time, the northern lights started coming out. This green orb that we finally noticed after we were not talking to each other started to dance in the sky and grow, and the strings of green and pink began to come out. I remember thinking, this is one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen. And I'm so happy I get to share this moment with my best friend. And I wanted to tell Anne that, but I wasn't talking to her. And so we continued paddling in silence. The only thing we said to each other that night was we were getting a little bit close to shore. It was harder to see the shoreline. And I asked Anne if she could shine her headlamp towards shore so I could see how far away we were. When she did, we saw two huge green eyes of a bull moose staring right back at us, less than 100 yards away. And all she said was, "Yep, we're too close to shore." We made up the next day. We actually wrote notes to each other while we sat next to each other in the tent and gave it to each other to better communicate to the other person how we were feeling. And really, we came to the conclusion that we're more than friends, we're sisters, and sisters fight, and they still love each other through it all. And after that communication interaction, our relationship only got better throughout the trip, which was great because we were about to be windbound for 7 days. I, during college, would have loved to be dropped off on a desert island with absolutely nothing to do. It's actually more stressful than you might think. We were stuck on a sand beach. Normally, Lake Winnipeg is known for its beautiful sand beaches, but the water level was 10 feet higher than usual that summer. And so really all we had was a very small sand beach, a berm, and swamp or muskeg on the other side. Not a lot of places to explore. So we were stuck on this beach. Our longest stint in a row was 3 days. The first day we were setting up camp and we were making an elaborate breakfast because we had time. And then we saw a snake come by. I overreacted and did not. And we, scared it away. But then another snake came by, and then another snake came by. And we looked into these sticks that were on shore, and there were a lot more snakes. So Manitoba actually has the highest snake population in the world at the Narcissa Snake Nests, which were less than 100 miles away from where we were camping. So we packed up all of our gear and we moved just around the bend to where there was not a massive pile of snakes and set up camp there. We stayed there for 3 days. The first day we played a lot of cribbage. The second day we were journaling, we caught up on sleep, but then you start to get really antsy. You start to get anxious because we're so used to being able to go where we want to go, regardless of what Mother Nature does when we live in the city, when we have 4-wheel drive, even if there's a snowstorm. But we were in a position where we could not leave because the forces of nature were too strong for us to battle. The third day, however, felt different. We woke up and I spent 8 hours carving a recorder out of a stick that didn't work. Anne was doing sand art and collecting stones, and there was a completely different vibe to being one with the land that we were on at that moment. Finally, we were able to continue on. At the end of Lake Winnipeg, we found the mouth of the Nelson River and we bawled because we were so excited to be done with this massive, very difficult part of our trip. And then we got to stay at a Cree community called Norway House. So Norway House First Nation hosts an event every year called York Boat Days, in which they race these York boats that you see in front of you. So these massive boats, this is what the Hudson Bay Company used to use, that they would make in a York factory where we were headed, to do fur trading and to travel all throughout these old Hudson Bay routes, which we were on. We were very lucky to stay with a Cree family while we were there. So Mike Mushwagen and his wife Janice allowed us into our home. We had contacted them beforehand, and they were amazing hosts. They told us all about the injustices to the Cree community. And as we know about Indigenous communities here in America, when we take people off of their land and when we strip them of the place where they are from, we also take away their future. And Mike was very, very honest about telling us about the struggles of this community. 85% of them are on welfare. Unemployment is extremely high. They are a dry community and suffer with alcoholism. The land was flooded by Manitoba Hydro without the consent of the First Nation community, and that completely changed their lifestyle. They no longer solely live off of the land. They're forced into a community where they're now grocery shopping, but the cheapest food is highly processed food, and you're starting to see diabetes and cancer and all these things start to show up in their community. Mike also said they have a stray dog problem at Norway House. So even in the winter, when we were there, they now have a humane society, but we were there almost a decade ago where they allowed a dog hunting season because the dogs would pack up in the winter and attack people. So Mike was showing us around town, and he joked around. He said, you know, you ladies are going into polar bear country. You should take a dog, because then if a polar bear comes, a polar bear will eat your dog and you'll have time to load your gun. This, I know, sounds ridiculous, but for two people who were very nervous to go into polar bear country, we thought, all right, bringing a dog along wouldn't be so bad. So we drove around that night with Mike's daughter looking for a dog about this big that we could put into a canoe and travel with for the rest of our expedition. We were driving around and I saw the silhouette of a dog licking ketchup packets off a parking lot outside of the movie theater, and I knew she was the one. So I ran out and I grabbed her and I put her in the car. This is Maihan. Mahihan in Cree means wolf, and Mike thought that she looked part wolf, and so we anglicized that and abbreviated it to Maihan. We put her in the canoe the next day, and it turns out she's afraid of water, which actually works out pretty well because she was not trying to jump out of our canoe into the water. Anne and I had already talked about everything imaginable. Most of our conversations at this point were just ridiculous stories of nothing pertaining to real life. And now we had this cute, fluffy thing in our boat, and our conversation really switched over to, oh, look what my Han's doing now. Oh gosh, look how cute she looks. And Anne's mom liked to joke that we knew what it was like to be married with a child. She was a wonderful companion for our next leg of the journey, which was paddling the Arctic Hayes River out to York Factory on Hudson Bay. This was in many ways the wilderness that we were trying to get to for over 2 months at this point. The whitewater rapids, we would turn the corner and see a moose standing in the water. You turn the next corner and you see a bear in the trees. The wilderness was very, very vibrant. We were finally paddling whitewater sets again. So Anne and I were paddling partners on our Arctic expedition that we went on where we met. And it's so fun to be able to work with someone to maneuver whitewater. And we were finally able to do that again. So I have a reading from my journal from the trip that I'm going to read to you while I also show sort of a video of the last part of our trip. So on the Etchemamish River, we encountered a lot of beaver dams and beaver lodges that we would have to pull our canoe over. So this was just one of them. And the Etchemamish in Cree means the river that flows both ways, and it connects the Nelson River to the Hayes River.
Holy shit.
So one time when we were lifting our canoe over one of these, I decided not to put my muck boots on, and I had my chacos on, and I put my foot in the water for less than 2 minutes, and when I took it out, I had 55 leeches on my feet. But now I'm not afraid of leeches.
I'm hoping that it'll like widen to our campsite.
So you can camp anywhere. We had to move a fallen tree to set up our tent this night, and we started to get a little loopy.
There she is, cooking away. Welcome to the kitchen. Today we're making biscuits in the pot.
So a dog at Norway House actually ate our bag of fresh food.
What did the dog think of that?
And we were only eating variations of Bisquick for the last 2 weeks.
This is me. It's day 84. I don't know.
It was really helpful to have Maihan along for our portages. Surprisingly, you don't have to portage very much to go from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay. The water is largely connected, but we did have about a mile-long portage was our longest portage, and they are not maintained paths whatsoever. It was great to have Maihan along because she would run the path before us, and in some cases we would see fresh bear scat, but we knew that any wildlife that was there knew that we were there as well. All right, so I'm gonna read my journal entry from the trip to document these last couple days. We ran several rapids until we reached White Mud Falls, our last portage set anything. I felt very emotional because I knew that after this portage, there was nothing that could stop us from making it to York Factory. The last few days brought emotional and physical challenges that left us exhausted and sore. After almost 3 months on trail, we were finally ready to end our trip. I felt a lack of nutrition had worn on my health, and I couldn't wait until I could eat fruits and vegetables again. While the hope of York Factory and relaxation was at our fingertips, we still had 200 kilometers to go on the river, and the rumors of polar bear country echoing in our minds. We paddled hard. Endurance and longevity are our strengths, and we plan to make the 4-day trip from White Mud to York Factory in a mere 2 days. Our day lasted 15 hours before the sun made us retire to the shore. The moon did not show as we built our first fire to fight the cold. We planned to stay up all night, but after an hour, we felt the weight of our exhaustion and gave in to the comfort of our tent and sleeping bags. Ironically, for Anne, it was one of the best nights of sleep, despite our anxiety in polar bear country. I slept, but I dreamt of creatures surrounding the tent and felt a deep sorrow that we would never actually make it to the end. We left camp that morning without breakfast and continued on the flowing haze. We heard stories of a thick fog and dark clouds typical to this section of the river, but we had a clear morning. We approached the turn where the God's River joins the haze, and we saw our first woodland caribou swimming across the water. The current quickened at the conjunction, and we had a floating breakfast of cold quinoa and chili powder from the night before. We continued on our way. With 10 more hours of paddling ahead, we felt as far away from York Factory as we ever had. Our wrists ached, hands clenched, and minds more than anything were on the verge of insanity. The river was beautiful, though. There were high, white mud cliffs on the right and low-lying spruces on the left, decorating the shoreline, always reminding us of our desolation. Our strokes slowed and stomachs turned, and we became desperate for the hours to pass. All of a sudden, from behind us, we heard a huge clap of thunder that spooked us both. Just then, a pack of wolves, 5 total, 1 black, came out to the riverbank from behind the spruce. The air was still. There was a suspicious calm. The wolves stopped in their tracks when they felt our presence. We stared, they stared. Myhan barked. Some time passed, and a bird broke the silence with a loud cry. The sound brought goosebumps to our skin. We glanced at the dark cloud floating behind us, and we were off with the motivation reminiscent of our efforts on the Red River. We reached the rock, a big rock on the riverbank that signified our remaining distance of 50 kilometers, 40 kilometers, 30 kilometers, 2 more hours. We sang every song we knew, including some Christmas medleys. We saw seals, caribou, black bears. Every white rock looked as if it were swimming our way, and I joked that someone should spray paint them all black to soothe the nerves of canoeists on the haze. We were 10 kilometers away. We were hungry, tired, and desperate. It felt as though something could still go wrong. A storm or a bear. Could we really just arrive unscathed at York Factory? We passed the point where the tide effect would slow us down, but we were still moving steadily toward the bay. We turned left, and there it was, Hudson's Bay. Overwhelmed with hunger, we did not joyously celebrate the sight of the bay, but solemnly paddled toward it. I didn't know what to say, and I didn't quite know how to feel. These last few days have been some of the most trying days of my life, and I knew I could relax now, but I felt an emptiness as well. This has been my life for 85 days, and there was no party or trophy at the end, just a set of stairs leading up to a building that once manufactured York boats. How was this a major destination for canoeists? Who made the bay into a rite of passage? The history is interesting, and we were in awe at the expanse of water, but what made our voyage so significant and important to others? I do not yet understand the magnitude of our adventure and the importance of being the first 2 women to complete it. I'm sure I will reflect on these questions for years to come. So here is a picture of York Factory. I took this picture on a 33mm camera, and it was actually inverted when they printed it. And so if you are familiar with York Factory, you know that this is sort of the inverse of what it actually looks like. But that big white building there is the main building at this property. It used to be a community of 300 people, and when Eric Sevareid and Walter Pork got there in the 1930s, they actually went to church. Now this is all that is left of York Factory. They've actually had to move that white building 3 times because the bank you see there erodes an average of 8 meters a year due to the melting permafrost and increasing temperatures in this part of the world. When Anne and I got there, we climbed the stairs, and then we took the caretakers by surprise. They said, "It's a good thing you're here because the season is ending early and we're all leaving tomorrow." Just after we had paddled 200 kilometers in 2 days to get there. It would have been fine if they weren't there. We would have set up camp like any other day, but the chance of encountering a polar bear was much higher closer to the shores of Hudson Bay. We were so hungry because we didn't want to stop paddling and waste time eating food. That's how much we wanted to get there. So when we finally pulled up on shore, the first thing we did was we plopped down and we started making any food that we had left over. As we were doing that, the caretaker said, "You all should really come inside." And we said, no, we're hungry, we're gonna eat. And then next thing you know, we see a polar bear come around the corner, and it starts to sort of meander our way, maybe about 200 yards away. And we look up at the caretaker and we're like, "Okay, we're done, we'll go inside." So we go inside of the house, which you can see in this picture across from the big white building. And we learn all about the history of York Factory. We got to tour what is now the museum in this white building. artifacts just pop out of the banks. All these old tools that they used to build York boats just pop out of the soil as it erodes into the river, and they put everything in that building. Here's the church that Eric Sevareid and Walter Port went to. It is propped up because it was slowly sinking into the ground. Anne and I were able to brand our canoe paddles with the York Factory sign, the YF that you see here, which is what they used to brand the York Factory boats. The M on our paddles is what we got to brand our paddles with after our long trip through Minojin. We got to sleep inside of the cabin that they had, which was great, especially since we knew there was a polar bear walking around. And I was really excited to sleep in a bed. The last week of our trip was really exhausting and we hadn't slept much. We had spent a lot of our hours paddling and then being nervous about encountering a polar bear. So I was really excited to sleep, but Anne woke me up super early and she's like, "You've got to see this." I was like, "Okay." So I push this big metal door out of the cabin, and as the sun is rising, we see the polar bear running on the boardwalk, the caretaker's German Shepherd chasing the polar bear, and the caretaker on an ATV with a gun chasing that, and they're all moving about the same speed. And I swear it was straight out of a Wes Anderson film or something. So I look over at Anne and I say, "I think it's time we go home." So we took a 45-minute, $2,000 float plane from York Factory to Gillam, Manitoba, where we caught a 35-hour train ride back to Winnipeg. When we got to Winnipeg, our friends picked us up, but as we were loading the van, I noticed that our gun was still loaded, and I wanted to unload it before we crossed the border back into the US. And so I gave it to Anne, and I continued loading things. And then I look around and it's rush hour in Winnipeg. People are getting out of work, walking around, a very busy downtown area. And then I look over at Anne. She's in her muck boots and she's just pumping our shotgun. I'm like, I feel like this is weird, but I've been out of society so long that I don't actually know. So we were nervous to cross the border because we had picked up a dog. But when we got there, our friend Megan handed over our passports, and the border agent, this wonderful woman, said, "Well, what have you been doing?" And Megan said, "Well, these ladies just paddled to Hudson Bay." And the woman goes, "Well, no shit, go on ahead." And we were like, "We have a gun and we got this dog." And she's like, "Oh, that sounds awesome." She did her job really well, but she was very, very excited to hear about our trip. So we drove to northern Minnesota, where Anne's parents have a cabin, and we literally just sat on her porch for 2 weeks doing nothing but eating and sleeping and sitting and looking out over a lake that once looked so big to us and now looked so small. This trip, for me, I thought it was going to be a hole in my resume. You know, they tell you you're supposed to get an internship or a job right after school, and we weren't getting those things. And so we were like, well, screw it. We'll just live in a canoe for 3 months. This trip actually ended up being the thing that unfolded my career. Everything over the last decade of my life has been related to rivers. And through this expedition and all of my river expeditions, as you paddle with water, you start to see the interconnectedness of the world that we live in. And especially when you paddle with water, water touches everyone, it touches everything. And you start to see how all of these things are connected in a meaningful way that for me has allowed me to view that same interconnected system in anything that I do or anything that I try to understand. I wrote a book. It's called Hudson Bay Bound, and University of Minnesota Press published it or is publishing it. It comes out in February, and the link is in the chat. It's natalie-warren.com if you want to order a copy of the book. There are a lot of stories that I did not share in this presentation that you might be interested in if you want to learn more. I end every presentation with a poem. So this is a poem called A Man Who Wanted to Live His Life Over by Robert Bly. What? You want to live your life over again? Well, I suppose, yes, that time in Grand Rapids. My life, as I lived it, was a series of shynesses. Being bolder, what good would that do? I'd open my door again. I've felt abashed, you see. Now I'd go out and say, All right, I'll go with you to Alaska. Just opening the door from inside would have altered me a little. I'm too shy. And so a bolder life is what you want? We could begin now. Just walk with me down to the river. I'll pretend this boat is my life. I'll climb in. All right, Tony, that's all I got.
Natalie, that was amazing. I did not know a fraction of this story when we worked together. This is fantastic.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. You want to like go for another couple hours and tell some of those stories you can share with us? All right. Sorry. If anyone has any questions, use your Q&A chat. And Natalie, you have a little time to answer a few questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to, let's see, I'm not able to see the screen share, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and now I can see the chat.
Okay. So can you see the Q&A chat?
I do, and this is the most popular question.
Perfect.
Yep. So Anne got the dog. She and Maihan are best friends. They basically have the same personality, and it was difficult to decide who got what. It was sort of like going through a divorce, but a very amicable one. And I'm so happy that Anne took Maihan with her to Colorado and has since been on many canoe trips and mountain biking trips with her. Maihan, however, now is 10. And when we picked her up, she was only 6 months old, which we did not know at the time. And she has a degenerative disease in which her legs are slowly starting not to work. So if you are interested, you can follow Maihan the Canoe Dog on Instagram. But I don't know that she has much longer to live, so it might be a sad ending there.
There's a question I see, says, how often did you have to refuel with food?
Great question. So we packed out a month of food at a time. For the Minnesota River, we made it all the way until Fargo. And then the next month, Anne's parents resupplied us there. And then we shipped a box of food to Norway House. So we connected with the Mushwagan family before we got there. And that was our last food drop. We also were able to go grocery shopping in a couple places. We would hitchhike into towns. And at Norway House, we went grocery shopping. But like I mentioned in the presentation, right before we left, our food bag was eaten by a bunch of stray dogs. And we didn't know that until we were already a day away from Norway House. So that was all of our salami and our cheese that we didn't have.
Oh, wow. How many total days was the trip?
It was 85 days.
85 days, wow. And how many miles?
About 2,000. It's really hard to calculate because if you read the book, you'll learn we actually went from the east shore of Lake Winnipeg over to the west shore, got windbound for several days, and then made it back to the east shore. So we did a lot of zigzagging, so I don't know the exact mileage of our route. Eric Sevareid says that it's 2,300 miles. We calculated that it's less for us in the route that we took, and they actually continued up and around the Nelson for their route. So around 2,000.
Did you have like a kind of an average mile per day? You guys figured that out, or I'm sure it varied throughout the trip, but
yeah, it did. So this trip is really cool. Out of all of the expeditions I've done, it's been my favorite trip because it's technically 4 trips in one. You're upstream, you're downstream, you're on a huge lake, and then you're on a whitewater river. So upstream, like 1.5 miles an hour, downstream, 5 to 7 miles an hour, on the lake, 3 to 4 miles an hour. And then on the river, I mean, we went 100 kilometers in a day. So it really depends on what part of the trip you're on.
sure. I see a question says, how many times were you able to shower?
Very few. maybe 3 times in 3 months.
Oh, wow.
But we would jump in the water later on the trip. You know, the Red River and the Minnesota River are fairly polluted.
Sure. See a question here says, what are you doing now in addition to writing books? That's what is a three-parter. What suggestions do you have for connecting kids to water that doesn't involve a 2,000-mile, 3-month excursion?
Great. Awesome. I do a lot of things. I am in a PhD program at the University of Minnesota in communication studies. I also teach at the University of Minnesota. I teach public speaking and interviewing there, and I do trail town consulting work. And so I work with communities to increase paddle sports tourism and help them develop their water trails and places to paddle for people. I write for outdoor publications as a freelance writer. I'm a musician. My husband is a professional musician, and we play a lot of music together. And now I'm a mom. So thinking about your second question is something that has been on my mind. And I first want to say, like, I don't have time to go on 3-month canoe trips anymore. It really is a point in my life. It has been, I paddled the Mississippi, I paddled up to Hudson Bay, I've paddled the Yukon, but I don't think I could do those things with the responsibilities that I have now. And so I'm really glad that I took advantage of that time and place in my life to be able to do that. And I recognize that that is an absolute privilege that not a lot of people have. Something that I have come to terms with is that I can't leave for 3 months anymore. And so I have incorporated paddling more into my day-to-day life. I live 2 miles away from the Mississippi River, and I try to get out and paddle north to downtown as much as I can. I've been on lakes and rivers near Minneapolis where I really do feel like I'm getting a wilderness experience. And so I would just say, explore the place where you live. That's going to be the most valuable experience for you versus exploring somewhere that is far away and difficult to get to. Those places are also really valuable, but there's nothing more meaningful than developing a sense of place and understanding where to paddle where you live.
Definitely. Do you still have a canoe? And if so, do you still use it?
Yes, I do. That canoe also went down the Mississippi, so it has split the country in half. And the wood has just started rotting and the yoke broke off. So I need to repair it, but it is in my garage.
Very cool. Jim asked, what kind of maps/guides did you use? And did you ever get lost? Or did you just follow the water flow?
Because it was flooded, you could not just follow the water because, especially on the Minnesota River, you would end up in really bizarre side channels. And same thing on the Hayes River. We actually almost paddled over a class 5 ledge, which is a small waterfall. And in a panic, we finally got away from it, got in an eddy, and went down a side channel, and we were lost for 2 days, couldn't find the main channel of the river again. And that is something that, like, we should have looked more at our maps at that point. We use different maps for different parts of the trip. Like the state Department of Natural Resources has maps for the Minnesota River, the Red River. I forget where we got our Lake Winnipeg maps, but there's a book called Hap Wilson wrote a series of books about Arctic rivers that detail each whitewater set. And that was really important for us to have, because if you just know that there's a whitewater set, that is not as helpful as understanding, is it a class 3 technical whitewater set in which there's a large boulder in the middle, and then what's the recommended route to get around that. So we had pretty detailed whitewater maps for the Hayes River.
Very interesting. I like what you said about, finding place and where you're at. So we all, love the opportunities to go somewhere else, but if you don't appreciate the places that you physically are, I guess, I don't know, what's the point in even living there? It's something that I've always kind of felt strongly about.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I think we answered everyone's questions. If you have any question, speak now or type now. Forever hold your peace. All right, well, Natalie, thank you so much for joining us this evening and presenting. This is amazing. Thank you, everyone, for attending. If you have any questions for Natalie that you think of later, you can email me, and I can relay them to her, and we'll try to get back and forth that way. Be sure to check out Natalie's website and pre-order the book. It's a fantastic thing. And don't forget to donate to the Herschel Interpretive Center solar panels, which would be really, really cool, and get one of those personalized bricks This is going to be part of the landscaping of that project. Maybe a really awesome way to celebrate the holidays. All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. It's really strange to talk to no one, but I know that you're there, and I appreciate you listening to my story.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.